Hey, Joe Gilder here from HomeStudioCorner.com with round 3 of my 3-part series that I'm doing on the recording process explained. So in the first 2 videos, if you haven't checked them out, there'll be a link below to the videos or to a playlist with those if you're watching on YouTube. And in the first video, I talked about pre-production, how important that is to do things like write charts and prepare the songs, pick the right tempo, scratch tracks, all that. In the second video, which I think is probably the most important part of the process, is the recording process. We talked about getting it right at the source. We talked about recording tracks and then listening back to make sure that they are right before moving on. We talked about how we don't record things badly and expect to be able to fix them in the mix. Fixing it in the mix, that's not really a thing that you can do. You can do some things. You can't fix bad tracks in a mix. So today, we're probably going to talk about the one, it's my guess, and if you're watching this a few months or years in the future, go look at the number of views on these 3 videos, and I'm be fairly certain that this video will have more views than the other 2 because people love mixing. So today we're going to talk about the mixing and mastering part of that process and kind of my process for getting through that. People love mixing. That is why most people find me and find my YouTube channel because I talk about mixing. They're searching for mixing advice and they find it. And mixing is fun. I love to mix. It is really, really fun. Over the years, it used to be my favorite part of the process. It was the thing, if I could just mix all day, I'd be super happy. Now I've evolved. I do like mixing, but way more than that now, I really like recording. It probably comes out in the last video when I talked about recording. I like it because that's when the music is being created. Mixing is when it's just being kind of organized and tweaked and put into its place. And it's very important and it's very fun. But for me right now, the recording part is where it's at. That's where there is nothing and then there is something, right? I mentioned it being almost a godlike experience to create music. To me, that's the most creative part of the process for me right now. But I love mixing. And what I find and what I found over the years, over the last 8 years of running Home Studio Corner, is that people really want mixing advice. They want to know how to mix. They want to know the tricks. They want to know which plugins to use. They want to know how to use them. They want to know how to get that sound, how to get that sound. How did you get that sound? And it's funny when people email me like, hey, Joe, I really loved your guitar tone on this song. How did you mix it to get that sound? The questions are not always, but almost always framed in the context of what did you do in the mix to get this sound? And what did you do in the mix to get this snare drum sound? What did you do in the mix to get that drum room sound? What did you do in the mix to get that vocal sound? And while there are answers to those questions, and some of those questions are legit, a lot of those questions aren't. And a lot of times I'll reply to them with, well, if you look at my mix session for that guitar tone you're asking about, I didn't do anything to it. That was how I recorded it. That was mic choice. That was guitar tone. That was the way I played it with my hands. It was my choice of which guitar and which amp and which set of pedals to use. It was how I EQ'd it at the preamp. Maybe I rolled off some low end because I was using a ribbon microphone that has a lot of low end, and that's how I got it to sound how I wanted it to sound. I mean, that is it's for guitars especially, and guitar players kind of get that. They get, you got to get the tone right. The recording, you can only kind of polish it up a little bit. But people think that for really everything. How'd you get that bass sound? How'd you get that snare sound in your mix? And it's fun for me because once you can get them to realize that a huge chunk of that sound is from the recording, they don't like that answer, but it's the right answer a lot of the time. Now, yes, absolutely, I can. A raw snare drum does not sound like a mixed snare drum. That's probably the most. That and vocals, I think, are probably some of the most dramatic changes from a raw recording to a mix because you do tend to compress the snare and a vocal quite a bit, and that does give you different sounds. So I readily admit that there are things we do to get a snappier snare drum sound than what we have in the recording because a raw recording with just a preamp can't get that snappy because it doesn't have compression. So I get all that stuff. But what the point I'm trying to get across is that all your problems cannot be solved with mixing. You can't mix your way out of a bad recording. I said that in the last video. It just doesn't happen, okay? So one thing I didn't mention, and I'm kicking myself right now that I forgot to mention in the last video. So I talked about the recording process as being kind of the pre-mixing process, is when you do everything that needs to be done before it's time to mix. Two things that I didn't mention are, once you have the recording, sometimes there are things to be done to the recording itself, such as what's called in around Nashville pocketing, where you're taking a part that's a little bit out of time and you're fixing those timing issues. You're taking it and sliding it around, or you're using some sort of audio bend or elastic audio feature to tighten up the performance. That, for me, is still a part of the recording phase. The other piece of that puzzle is things like auto-tune and Melodyne. Up until recently, I didn't use that a lot in projects. I'm starting to embrace it as a useful and helpful tool. It will not make you a better singer. And so if you're a bad singer, Melodyne won't make you a better singer. It'll just make you a bad singer who's on pitch. And it's no replacement for making sure you do get it right at the source and you do sing it well and you're not just terribly off pitch the entire time. However, it is helpful for taking those spots where you nailed the performance, the energy, the emotion, the tone, and the voice is perfect, but it just went under the pitch or it just went a little bit sharp. Those are places where I find it to be super helpful. And that's a pretty recent development for me, but that for me still falls under the umbrella of recording. I used to say, let's do recording and then let's do the editing, which is all this other stuff. And to me, it's all one and the same. A lot of times, just a few weeks ago, I had a singer here. She sang the song, and then she sat right here, and we tuned it together. And that was it. We were done. So we edited it. We comped together the different vocal takes to get a final vocal take, and then we tuned it, and we were done. But we weren't done with recording for the entire album, and we hadn't started mixing, but it was a recording session, and that's what we did. So that's a little big asterisk to the beginning of this video. That should have been included in the last video. Please forgive me. But now I've said it, so at least it's in here somewhere. So now let's talk about mixing. You're done with recording. Everything's recorded, everything's edited, everything's tuned that needs to be tuned. You've got everything there, and it's sounding like a song. It's time to do mixing. Here are some ways that I like to approach that. First of all, along the way, and this is a question I get quite often, should I use any mixing while I'm recording? Should I use any plugins in the mix during the recording phase, or should I just wait until I'm in the proper mixing phase? I absolutely mix as I go. So once we've recorded drums, I'm probably going to put a compressor on the drum bus and probably EQ that snare and that kick a little bit, and maybe throw EQ across the entire drum kit. That's probably going to happen. And what happens for me in those situations is usually I'll tweak those as we go along through the recording process. And by the time it's time to start mixing, I'm pretty close to the drum sound that I want. And so I start from there. I don't have this weird purist approach that says I have to wipe everything out and completely start from scratch. If you feel that that's the best way to do it, go for it. But I do a few subtle mixing things along the way so that when it's time to mix, I'm already kind of have a head start on the mix. However, if you are starting completely from scratch, or maybe you just recorded everything and you're just a purist and you said, I'm not touching plugins until it's time to mix, I kind of respect that. And it forces you to even do an even better job in the recording process to make everything sound great with no plugins at all. Whatever the case may be, once it's time to mix, for me, there's a bit of a process to mixing. And I've got courses I've done. I've got one called speed mixing where on camera I mix a song in an hour. One of them has like 60 something tracks, and it's stressful, and you just have to kind of cut corners and do a lot of bus processing to make it happen. And so I think there is value in learning to be quick. I don't think that's the be-all, end-all of this process. How long it takes you to mix a song is fairly irrelevant. For me, on average, anywhere from, there are songs that I mix in 2 hours, hour and a half, and there are songs I mix in 5 or 6 or maybe more. Maybe I mix it in 4 hours and then have to go do a bunch of remixing stuff and do tweaks for another couple hours. Like that's, and maybe even longer. So don't gauge your mixing skills or your mixing prowess by how long it takes you to mix. It's necessarily going to take you longer the earlier you are in the process. But it doesn't have to take long just because you think it should take a long time either. If you sit down for 90 minutes and it feels amazing to you, don't feel like you have to put in another 2.5 hours just because that feels right. You can very well be done, right? So for me, the end result is, what does the mix sound like? Which is an obvious thing to say, but it needs to be said because a lot of times people want to over mix because they think they need to. They look at a YouTube video and see somebody who's got a plug-in on every track, and they think, oh, I need to do that too. So I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. The first stage of the process for me is what I lovingly is probably my favorite part of the mixing process, and it's the static mix. What I mean by static mix, I mean it's the part where I just move faders and move panners, and that's it. So when it's time to start mixing, a lot of times I may just pull everything down and then just bring up the drums, bring up the bass, bring up the guitars, and just kind of reintroduce everything to myself and get a nice balance out of everything. If there were already plugins in the session from before, if I'm happy with how they sound, I will leave them. If I'm not, I may bypass them and then approach those later. If I'm mixing a song from scratch for a client, for example, where I didn't record it, they just sent me the raw tracks, this stage of the process for me is completely without plugins. I'm literally just moving faders, adjusting volumes, adjusting panning. And that may only take 10 minutes. I may spend an hour and a half on that. There have literally been songs I've worked on. Usually they're with bigger track counts and there's a lot of production there. So it just takes time to go through and say, okay, what is this little track doing? Okay, it's doing that. Let's put that over here. What's this track doing? So there's some of that, but a lot of times it's just you're deciding and you're moving faders to decide what's going to be the emphasis here. Is this going to be pretty heavy on drums and bass, or are they more secondary to these cool guitar parts that are happening? There are some strings here. Are those pretty prominent? Is this kind of an orchestral thing, or are they more in the background? And you're playing around with these things and making these decisions. One of the big mistakes that I see people make or people tell me about is they'll pull up a session and they'll move faders up and say, okay, and then they'll solo the kick drum and they'll start EQing the kick, and then they'll compress the kick, and then they'll move to the second kick drum mic and do the same thing, then the snare mic, and then the other snare mic, and they'll just move literally from left to right through their session until they've processed every single track in solo, meaning they listen to that track by itself, they do all their EQ and compression and whatever else they're going to do work to it, and then they listen and say, that sounds amazing, let's move on. What happens in those situations most of the time is when they've gone through that process, and if you're talking 30, 40 tracks of audio, that's going to take a while. They get to the end and they say, man, this is going to sound great. And then they turn on everything together and it sounds like garbage. 9 times out of 10. Okay, maybe not 9 times out of 10, but more often than not, taking that approach where you just mix everything in isolation and then expect it to all go together, it ends up not working at all, and you are now going in. Every track has 2 or 3 plugins on there, and you're trying to fix what you've broken. When in reality, I'd be willing to bet you $1 that the mix would sound way better if you had just not put any plugins on there and just moved the faders and spent time setting those levels and putting things in the right space as far as panning. I almost can guarantee that the mix would sound better that way before you throw any plugins on there than if you go individually one by one and put plugins on everything. That's one of the big things that's hard for people to break away from, this idea of leaving things alone. Your job as a mix engineer is absolutely to get a good balance, to bring out the essence of the song, but also to get rid of things that don't need to be there. So sometimes it's okay to mute a part that's not working by your judgment, right? And also your job is to leave things alone when they need to be left alone. There have been mixes where I've only put maybe an EQ across the drum bus and I haven't touched any of the other pieces, right? I haven't EQ'd the kick drum. I haven't EQ'd the snare because it sounded good. It sounded right. It was recorded well, and based on the style of music and what I wanted the mix to sound like, it was working. And if it's working, leave it alone. You know, the whole if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Don't feel like your job as a mix engineer is to do something to every track. Your job is, if that's what you think your job is, that's actually a lazy approach. Your job is to think critically and to decide what needs your attention. And the more you can resist the urge to do things just because you think you need to do them, and to do them only if it serves the mix and serves the song, and if it's a problem that needs to be addressed or a really great part that needs to be enhanced, when you get to that part, you'll notice that your mixes are starting to sound much better and much less processed. I'm not saying you can't really squash a lead vocal with compression or really go overboard with reverb on your drums if the song calls for it. You can. I'm not promoting a minimalist approach to the actual sound of your mix, but I am promoting a level of self-control, especially early in the process when you aren't super confident in your skills. Hold back. Don't put 8 plugins on your vocal chain just because you saw someone else do that. Only put things in that need it, right? Only put things in your session if you have a very specific reason for putting it. If you're working on the bass and you say, well, that sounds good, I guess I better put a compressor on there. Just imagine me on your shoulder saying, okay, why are you putting a compressor there? Like literally imagine that you hired me to be like your mix mentor. And I'm literally sitting behind you, arms folded, being quiet, and you get a great bass tone, and then you reach for a compressor, and I lean up and say, why are you doing that? Now, that's not to say you shouldn't compress bass. Maybe it absolutely needs it, but you should be able to answer that question. So when I lean up and say, hey, why'd you add that compressor? You should say, here's a viable answer. Well, Joe, and by the way, you're looking dapper today. I was thinking I like the sound of the bass, but the sustain of the bass is getting lost. So he hits a note, and then I'm not really hearing it sustain throughout the rest of that phrase. And he's not playing a lot of notes. It's not a very busy part, but I'm hearing the bass really well, and then it disappears. I think compression will allow me to turn down those louder parts, turn up the tail of those notes so that I'm hearing him with a little bit better and more consistent sustain. And I would say, great, make it so, number one. Or you might say, it sounds good, but there are spots where certain notes on the bass, you know how this works. If they switch to a different string, some notes can jump out and be a lot louder. And you may say, I'm going to try to do a faster attack compression that really just hits those louder notes when they come out so that everything's a little more consistent. And I would say, brilliant. I agree. Let's do that. But if you say, well, I just always put compressor on the bass. Wrong answer, right? It needs to serve a purpose. It needs to have a reason for being there. Otherwise, it's just going to add extra work to you, extra time to your mix times, which nobody wants to mix longer just for the sake of mixing longer. But it's also very, very likely to potentially hurt your mixes. I do a lot of mix critiques for people. And a common theme of people who are new to mixing is you kind of have this, as soon as you hit play, you hear it and you say, yeah, they did a lot. It sounds like they did a lot to it. Right? When I listen to professional mixes, I think it may sound really loud. It may sound really compressed. It may sound really punchy and really snappy and really bright, but it doesn't sound like overdone, right? Kind of like, and almost like these more beginner mixes sound overcooked. Like they said, they discovered what a compressor is and they used it on every channel to the nth degree, and they discovered EQ and they just jacked up all the frequencies they liked throughout the mix, and so it sounds very hyped and it sounds very clustered or cluttered, and generally it sounds like it has a lot of lows and a lot of highs, and the mids are kind of out of there, or it's very, very muddy and doesn't have any kind of warmth to it other than the mud. Those are some of the common things that I hear, and a lot of times, if the tracks are good, it's because they overmixed it. On the flip side, if I'm hearing those things, it could be because the tracks themselves were bad, and that's obviously something we've already discussed. Excuse me. So let me talk about a little bit about more my process and some general theory around mixing that you should think about, and then a couple of resources that might be good for you, helpful for you as well. So the static mix, I've talked about that. It's very important. It is really where the life of the mix happens. When you're doing your static mix, you'll be tempted to say, that vocal just jumped out too loudly. And you can go fix that if you want. But for me, a lot of times, I just think I make note of that, but I'm worried about bigger picture stuff like the overall balance. Once I have that, then I do what I think it's Jakir King calls it this, raise your hand mixing. And I do a lot of this. Instead of, once I have the static mix, you may think then I go left to right and go kick drum, snare drum. I don't really. Occasionally I start with the drums because they're harder to get right because there's so many pieces. It's a bunch of stuff as one kind of, it's drums, but there's like 12 tracks. So sometimes I will start there, mute everything else, and just make sure the overall drum sound is working. But then I'll introduce everything back in and start to work on things that are problematic. And I may go through and like, okay, drums need a little less mid-range. Let's do a little compression. Great. Okay, bass. Some of those compression things we talked about before, maybe that's what it needs, and it's a little muddy, so we remove some mid-range. Okay, guitars are a little harsh overall, and all this stuff is usually happening on these buses that I've used. So I've got all the individual tracks. They're all going through this set of about 8 buses that I normally use: drums, bass, electrics, acoustics, keys, vocals, background vocals, 7. And so I'll do a lot of the processing there. That's what I've come to call backwards mixing, where I mix on the buses and do some general big picture stuff on there and the mix bus, before I go do things on the individual tracks. It's a good way to force yourself not to overdo things because you're only really mixing 7 tracks versus 40, because you're really only working on the overview. Once you've got your static mix, you just kind of do tonal changes and compression changes here. And if that works, great. You don't have to do anything else down the chain. If it doesn't work, you can obviously go back and work on individual tracks. It's a good practice to get into, and it can really help you keep that hands-off approach that so many people need when they get too handsy with their mixes. So that's kind of my approach. I do that, and then I'm just constantly going through and listening for what's bothering me. That's bothering me. Let's fix that. Okay, we fixed that. Let's back up. What's bothering me? Oh, that's bothering me. Let's fix that. And it's just a constant, random, what is bothering me approach. If you haven't checked out my Mix Together series, you can find that on my YouTube channel or go to homestudiocorner.com. It'll be pretty easy to find. It's where I mix a song from start to finish in these small chunks, these small episodes. You can download the tracks and mix through it with me. But you'll notice, it's not a series that I could script and say, in episode 1, we'll do this. In episode 7, I guarantee we'll be doing this. Because every mix is a complete adventure, and I don't know where it's going to go. I think at this point, I'm not quite done with the first round of that series. I think I have 3 separate videos on mixing vocals. I mixed the vocals, and I was happy. I moved on. A few videos later, I said, I'm still not happy with that vocal sound. Let's do this. And I did some things, and then I moved away. And then later on, I was like, still not happy with that vocal sound, and I went back. That, to me, you may think that's just completely random and undisciplined. Maybe it is, but that's just the way it works for me. I work on things that bother me until I don't have anything that bothers me anymore. The one big question that people will ask me about mixing is, how do I know when I'm finished? And the approach that I take, I'm not great at doing this every single time, but when it's a mix that I'm really, I'm kind of crunched for time and I really have to finish, what I'll usually do is pull out something like a legal pad, and I will listen to the mix, and I'll take notes of like to-do items, little check boxes, and I won't allow myself to touch anything. I hit play, and I back away with a pen and a piece of paper, and I just listen. And I say, okay, yeah, snare feels loud in the verse. And then later on, snare still feels loud in the third chorus. So I know, okay, maybe it's loud overall. Somewhere else I might say vocal too quiet in the verse. In first verse. And then later I might say vocal levels perfect in the last chorus. So I know that if I had just turned the vocal up during verse 1, then it would be too loud in the final chorus. I know that's something I need to go automate. I need the vocal to be louder just in this one section, not overall. Those are the kind of things you get to listen to when you stop touching things and let yourself sit back and listen to the entire song from start to finish. You get an overview picture. You have notes of things that bothered you. And then now you've got a very simple to-do list. Go down that list and fix all those things. Once you've done that, do it again. Stop and listen, take notes. And you may go through this process tons of times. I usually wait till I feel like I'm pretty happy with things before I start this process. But then once I do, it may be 2 or 3 times, and I finally get down to where there's just 2 things I don't like. I fix those, and I'm done with the mix. That's a very practical way to see that I'm done with the mix. Now, you may think there's always something I don't like about a mix, and yeah, I get that. That's always true. But it's a great way to hone things down and get a lot closer to the end than just kind of randomly sitting there and hoping you'll just feel right about it. A couple of quick things. When it comes to using EQ, I'm a big fan of what's called subtractive EQ. I would much rather remove problem frequencies before I boost frequencies I like. So remove frequencies I don't like versus boost frequencies I do, or at least remove the bad frequencies first and then boost some that I like. The better you get at recording, the less of this you have to do because your recordings aren't coming in super muddy that need all that cutting in the mid-range and the low mids. But even still, I still like to remove treble frequencies before I boost others. And compression, one piece of advice there, be careful using really fast attack times. My default attack time is probably 30 milliseconds. And then I'll go faster for specific reasons. But if you go with a lot of fast attack times on your mixes, on your buses, or especially on your mix bus, you kill a lot of the punch and the transients in the audio, okay? Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes I'll go fast attack on a snare drum and it's kind of cool, or a fast attack on the vocal and it kind of catches it really early on and is a cool sound. But in general, I like slower attack times that let the mix still happen and then clamp down after some of that punch and transient has come through the compressor. So those are some very general thoughts. If you want more training on using specifically EQ and compression, I've got courses that I've created on those. They're called Understanding EQ and Understanding Compression. You can check those out on my website. Those are probably my two most popular courses. Kind of almost required material if you're in the home studio corner world and really want to get at the heart of how I use EQ and compression. I highly recommend those. Or if not, check out my YouTube videos, the Mixed Together series, and more videos like this. Obviously, there's plenty of information there to help you as well. So once we've gotten to the end of the mix, we've exhausted our to-do list. We now know that we are done. Then comes time for mastering. And I'll just speak briefly about mastering. I recommend, if you can, have someone else master. If for no other reason than it has someone with different ears giving one final listen to your project before it's done. Now, I've done that, and I've been thankful for it, and it's been really helpful. I also have projects where it's up against a deadline. I don't have the luxury or the budget to hire someone else, so I'm mastering it myself. Biggest piece of advice I can have is work in some sort of time to step away and to come back and listen with fresh ears because you'll notice things better that way. I also do a lot of mastering on nicer headphones. These are Sennheiser HD 650s. They're expensive, but if you think about a proper mastering facility is very, very expensive with everything treated perfectly, with really nice monitoring systems and all that. Suddenly it makes these that are $300 to $500 seem less expensive because these are really high quality and the room doesn't affect it, right? If I'm listening on headphones, then I know I'm hearing it exactly as it is. There is no issue with the room affecting the sound that goes into my ears. So I do a lot of my mastering on there as kind of a final piece of the puzzle to make sure that I have the best and most accurate representation of what the thing sounds like. I am not a mastering expert. I don't talk a lot about mastering because I don't feel like I can speak to it as well as I can to things like mixing and recording and musicianship and all that. I do highly recommend my friend Ian Shepard. He runs the website Production Advice. So I think it's production-advice or productionadvice.co.uk. If you just search Ian Shepard, you'll see him. He's got a couple of classes on mastering, a lot of content. He's mastered a lot of my stuff. Great guy, great teacher on mastering. If you want to learn more about that, definitely check him out. But the biggest thing you can do in mastering is don't go for as loud as possible. Try to go for something reasonable. Do your research around metering and how to know what is a good level of volume, what's too loud, and things like that. Because if you just go for as loud as possible, you really kill the music a lot of the time. So a reasonable volume versus an extreme volume will make your music come out a lot better in the end, in my opinion. And so that's kind of the process for me. I've kind of walked you through over these last 3 videos how I think about and approach each phase of the process and how I kind of work my way through it. And yeah, it's been fun. So thank you. If you've watched all the videos, thank you. Leave a comment below if you have questions on things that I didn't explain well or things you'd like me to expand on further. I can either answer you in the comments or maybe shoot another follow-up video if that's helpful. But I'd love to hear from you. I love getting your comments and your feedback. If you've not subscribed to my channel on YouTube or subscribed to my email newsletter and all that stuff, please do. There's a lot more like this for you to explore and to discover. And so there's lots of good things there. But that's it for me today. Thanks for watching this video. I'm Joe from HomeStudioCorner.com, and I'll see you around.